Intend to look at and address the use of espionage and spies during the Revolutionary War, how it was used, who was involved, and some of the tactics that were used by the spies to gain their information. This was the beginning of the use of spies, counterintelligence, and the history of spies in the United States during wartime and the colonies' history as well. The laws regarding spies and spying have been around since prior to the Revolutionary War and have always entailed very little legal protection of war spies that are caught in the act. And we see that even back then with the punishment for such a crime that was execution. And we see that with the infamous revolutionary spies such as John Andre and Nathan Hale, just to name a few. The seriousness of using spies and espionage was there, but so was the seriousness of losing the war, and more importantly, losing the chance at independence, which is why the Continental Army and General George Washington knew they had to take that risk. When one thinks of the Revolutionary War, they tend to think of some of the more well-known aspects of what has been romanticized about the war. They remember individuals like George Washington and Paul Revere. They remember the Boston Tea Party, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and many other events and people. They remember locations such as Valley Forge, Saratoga, Lexington and Concord, Boston and Philadelphia. These people, locations, and events are steps towards independence that have been taught in our history classes at every level along the way for the students, from elementary to high school to college. But one aspect, or a few aspects, of the Revolutionary War and even the Continental Army that go under the radar is the use of espionage. The United States actually ran a very effective espionage and insurgencies against the British during the American colonies, or in the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. And the founder of that espionage and spy network was actually General George Washington. Washington assumed command of the Continental Army in July of 1775 and arrived in Boston, or in the Massachusetts colony, and went right to work on establishing that network. And in a journal entry, we see Washington's account of his readiness to use espionage, where he, quote, to $1,333 and $1/3 given to blank to induce him to go into the town of Boston to establish a secret correspondence for the purpose of conveying intelligence of the enemy movements and designs, end quote. And Washington notes at the bottom of that page that he cannot enter the name of the individual or individuals due to the sensitivity of the information that would be known, as well as the fact that those individuals were behind enemy lines. And the complexity of the plots in spy-to-spy thrillers just shows us how difficult and tricky and controversial counterintelligence can be. And yet, Washington was interested and ready to use such a network. And it goes into romanticizing some of the aspects of that, as one of his spies, Enoch Crosby, is actually the subject of James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Spy, which was America's first great spy novel that was based on the true exploits, trials, and tribulations of Enoch Crosby. So we see that the idea of espionage had been around even prior to Washington working on it as a member of the Continental Army. Early on in the French and Indian War, we see the British use a spy network to gain an advantage over the French, to help them keep the colonies in their hands. It was quoted as saying through his spies, Newcastle was acutely aware that the French were courting Quinets by dangling the promise of Silesia, end quote. And not so much that the information is what's as important as the fact that it was stated through his spies. It shows that the spy networks were already running deep in the British military and that they were aware of such a use of espionage. And they used those spy networks to keep track of the French and their movements and other essential information that gave them the upper edge in keeping the colonies on their side and winning that war. That being said, divided loyalties facilitated espionage by both sides. Recruiting spies was something relatively simple because the colonists, whether they were a American or a British sympathizer, spoke the same language, they shared the same heritage, and espionage swiftly became as important to the colonies as it was to the British. And while it was known as not something that was the most gentleman thing to do for that time period, we still see people such as Washington, John Jay, Nathan Hale, and other individuals that had an upper class background, and yet in order to gain their independence, used something that was considered as ungentlemanly as spying to risking their lives to do so. They looked at the use of the most modern technology of the time, advanced methods to gain the information and advantages that the Continental Army needed. This combination of unsuspecting individuals and modern technology would help be the key to a victory for the Continental Army. The military literature dealing with the intelligence published after the 18th century likely provided individuals such as General Thomas Gage with the British Army with key insights, specific examples, and guided principles to act with confidence, if not always with success. The same can be said of George Washington, and we see that information as well. One well-known aspect of the American Revolutionary War was the Culper spy ring. It was an American spy network operating during the War of Independence in America and provided George Washington with information on British troop movements. In November of 1778, George Washington appointed Major Benjamin Talmadge as Director of Military Intelligence and charged him with creating a spy ring within New York City, which at the time was the site of British headquarters. The network became known as the Culper Spy Ring and operated successfully in and around New York City for 5 years, during which time no spy was ever unmasked. Indeed, even Washington was ignorant of the spies' identities, and Talmadge and his informants consisted of friends that he made in school on Long Island, including Austin Rowe, Caleb Brewster, Abraham Woodall, and even Anna Strong. It was at the request of Washington that the Culper Spy Ring did its work in Long Island and in New York City and Connecticut. Credible reports about British activities were needed, and as an intelligence officer, Talmadge turned to his trusted childhood friends to help him. The spycraft included codes, aliases, and the sympathetic stain, which was invisible ink, was known to conceal information and the identities of the ring's members. Abraham Woodall, which his alias became Samuel Culper Sr., and Robert Townsend, alias Samuel Culper Jr., gathered intelligence in British occupied territories, and although Washington did not know the true identities of the spies, he was profoundly involved in giving directives and highly regarded reports from Townsend as evidence in his letters to Talmadge. Townsend's double life remained a secret until the 20th century, when Long Island historian Morton Pennypacker retained the services of graphologist Albert Osborne to confirm the penmanship used. Then there's Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale made a magnificent failure of his work, that 1 week that he gained everlasting fame, not for what he had accomplished, but for the patriotic spirit that he had, and that his willingness to run every hazard in the service of his country. Hale's legend is even more drama than fact. He was a hero for his willingness to die for his country, but from an intelligence perspective, he was a lousy spy. Hale was commissioned captain in the Continental Army in the New York City area and was used by Washington as sort of a ranger-like unit to conduct tactical reconnaissance of the British activities. General George Washington used espionage and the Culper spy ring and other forms of espionage to gain an advantage from the Continental Army. And as a result, the efforts by the Continental Army and their spies, they were able to know where the British troops were, where they were going, the number of troops, and the artillery and supplies that they had possessed. The information became invaluable to the Continental Army and specifically to General George Washington, as they would use this information not only to prevent the loss of their own troops, but also to lead to key movements by Washington's army that would enable them to certain victories in battles, as well as the avoidance of potential defeat in others. Washington relied on secrecy, and it was his, quote, cornerstone of Washington's philosophy of intelligence and deception operations, end quote. Washington would go on to write his own maxim when it came to intelligence, and that intelligence was, quote, for upon secrecy, success depends in most enterprises of the kind, and for want of it, they are generally defeated, however well planned and promising a favorable issue, end quote. So he looked at secrecy and espionage as a very important aspect of success when it came to war and to battles. And we see that while it doesn't go as popularized as his Battle of Saratoga for the Continental Army, or the Valley Forge Winter, or any of the aspects that Washington is best known for, or the Continental Army is best known for, it is a very essential part to every single bit of those, as well as the rest of the war for the Continental Army and the gaining of their independence. Now we're going to look at the women spies that were involved, and there's two that really come to mind right off the bat. First was Ann Bates. Bates was a school teacher in Philly. She joined Clinton's espionage network sometime in 1778. Her husband was a soldier and a gun repairman, so in Clinton's army. So she identified the weaponry. She reported important military information, such as the number of cannons, men, supplies, information like that. She also disguised herself as a peddler and would travel among all the American soldiers and camps, camp followers. That way she could observe the numbers of weapons and men in each camp that she visited. So a very undercover, covert mission that she did. She later, when all the supplies had been sold, she returned to the British camp and would report her findings to Clinton. Another one is Miss Jenny. There's not a lot known about Miss Jenny, both her personal and professional career in the intelligence gathering, but she did spy. Her expedition spying, played an important role in the British troop movements in the late summer of 1781 and earlier in the spring. She was part of Clinton's spy network as well. So we see a lot of abilities that women had in spying, a lot of it because they weren't part of military, so they could easily move in and out of the camps, and nobody would really notice them. So it was very important roles that those two specifically played for the British Army. As we look at some of the information that was gathered and how it was gathered, there were several different ways that spies utilized to gather information, one of which was invisible ink, and it was a secretive writing used by both sides, the American armies and the British armies, that consisted of invisible ink. The Revolutionary War, the invisible ink usually consisted of a mixture of ferrous sulfate and water. The secret writing was placed between the lines of an innocent letter and could be discerned by treating the letter with heat or a chemical substance. The recipient would place the paper over a flame or of a candle or treated it with a chemical reagent such as sodium carbonate, and it would reveal the hidden contents. The next slide will introduce a video that I explain a little bit of how this works with a visual demonstration of what they would use. So one method that the spies would use to relay messages would be the invisible ink. I've already kind of started this here, but to kind of give you an outline of how they would do it, what they would use, different type of paper than what we use today, more of a canvas type of paper, or almost leathery in a way. They would write a message out, as you can see here, to General George Washington, Continental Army, Valley Forge. And it would just be a general letter that they would write. Maybe some basic information, stuff, of non-importance, stuff like that. And they would take an acid, such as we have here, lemon juice and a little bit of water. And they would take a Q-tip, in our case, and they would write in between the lines what their message was. So you can see I already did some here, and I just type it, or put a little bit here. Now they would have to let it dry, and as it would dry, they would obviously package up their letter and they would send it off. So once the recipient would receive it, obviously they would see the regular letter, but they would take and hold it up to the candle. So you see, not a very good representation, but you see the British are coming. Well, the British. There you can see the start of headed north, which is kind of not as aware, and then be aware. We're all on there. Not the best of representation, but it would give you a general idea of what they were trying to do to relay messages. Typically, they would do this on a lot more confined space with a little bit more finer of a piece of equipment to write that in there, but the general idea was exactly this. Another aspect that the spies would use were called ciphers, or coded letters. Ciphers and secret codes were used to ensure the contents of a letter could not be understood if the correspondence had been fallen into the wrong hands. And ciphers and letters were used to represent and replace other letters and to mask the true message of what was being sent to the recipient. The letter's recipient would then utilize a key to which was referenced in corresponding pages and letters from a well-known book, such as a dictionary, to decode the document's true message. Some spy groups even created their own pocket guide to serve as a cipher's key, such as the Culper Code Book that was used by the Culper spy ring. Similarly, some letters were written in intricate secret codes where numbers and special characters were replaced the letters, a method that was actually most notably used by the Culper spy ring and deciphered in their Culper Code Book. Another way that spies used to relay messages was called masked letters, which the true contents of a letter were also hidden through the use of masked letters, which were intended to be viewed by a recipient who would place a shape template over such of a letter. You can see in the picture how there is a template placed over an entire page of wording, and how that works is that the letter would then appear within the boundaries of that mask. So as you can see the shape that is in the picture, you can actually see how a message would actually be deciphered left to right, top to bottom. And the letter and the mask were usually delivered in separate courier packages to ensure that the trick would go undetected. And it was a very common thing that was also used by Sir Henry Clinton and such. This picture is actually depicted as one of his examples of that was used as a masked letter. As we can see through the different methods and the different ways that spies worked, who was involved with spy networks such as George Washington, and some of the spies themselves, such as Nathan Hale, the Samuel Culper Sr. and Samuel Culper Jr. It was a very vast network of spies and spying, and how they actually used some of the methods that were considered modern at that time, such as coded messages. We even see that that coded messages were used prior to the Revolutionary War. In fact, it was James Wilkinson, General James Wilkinson, that actually informed the Spanish of Lewis and Clark's expedition and the secret goal of finding a land route to the Pacific, through the Western Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. So it even goes back to the times prior to the Revolutionary War. However, it really became popularized as it was used by both sides. And as I mentioned earlier, it was not the most gentlemanly thing to do at that time, as being caught in the act was punishable by death. And we see that like some individuals such as Major John Andre, who pleaded to be put to death by firing squad, which was considered the honorable way to go, since he was convicted of spying. It was actually George Washington that took it into his own hands and denied that request, and would put John Andre to death by hanging. So we see that it worked both ways. Individuals could either be successful at it, such as Culpers in that spy ring where no individual was ever named, and other members such as Nathan Hale or John Andre, who were convicted of spying, would ultimately meet their demise. It was a very important thing that General Washington put together for the colonies. They used that to gain an advantage, and ultimately, while it wasn't the only and it wasn't the primary reasoning for why they won the war, it certainly played a role very much under the radar and leading to the American independence that we enjoy today. So it was a very key thing that Washington did and recognized was very essential to the Continental Army.